Meanwhile, Florida Senator Rick Scott joined me on Sunday Morning Futures yesterday to discuss Americans' priorities and the key issues after the midterm elections. He is among several senators trying to postpone this Wednesday's Senate leadership elections. Here's Rick Scott.
They don't like inflation. They don't like an open border. They don't like $31 trillion worth of debt. In the last 16 years, the debt has gone from $9 to $31 trillion. We got to change. It's hurting our families. I grew up poor, Maria. I mean, my family was dealing with inflation when I was growing up. I watched that. It's hurting our families. We got to deal with these issues.
Joining me right now, a woman who has been dealing with these issues and communicating it, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget President, Maya MacGuineas. Maya, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for being here. You've spoken so much about the $31 trillion in debt, the implications of more borrowing. First, tell us about the money spent and borrowed in the last 2 years and why interest rates going higher make that even more dangerous.
Maria, this is the situation that we've been warning about and you and I have been talking about for so many years, which is you can't borrow, keep borrowing, and expect your economy to be able to endure those problems. What we've had now, during COVID, we borrowed. That was the right time to borrow. Those bipartisan bills made sense. At the end of COVID, however, once the Biden administration came in and did a unilateral bill, we started borrowing more than the economy could absorb post-crisis. And the administration has continued to borrow for almost all of its bills since then, with one important exception, the Inflation Reduction Act, which had small deficit improvements, and that was a step in the right direction, till a few days later when they started borrowing again. The problem with all of this is that when you're borrowing beyond what your economy can absorb, it leads to inflation. And we now have a terrible situation where inflation is obviously harming families. Interest rates are going up. And every 1 percentage point increase in interest rates beyond what we're expecting, because our debt is so large, leads to massive new amounts of borrowing to pay those interest payments. $240 billion a year just for a 1 percentage point increase above expectations. So we are in a very vulnerable economic position from all this borrowing. Also, it makes us weak geopolitically. You know, big talks are going on this week. And so this, again, is what we've been saying. You can't put yourself in this dangerous position, and getting out of it's going to be difficult.
Yeah. So you've talked about the administration borrowing $5 trillion. The president the other day said, look, you know, we are done with the midterms. Well, we're waiting on a few races and nothing's going to change, that he doesn't see any impetus to actually change course. So how do you think the midterms impact fiscal policy?
Well, things have to change, and they will either happen because we have political leadership or because we have some kind of a crisis. And frankly, we're already in the beginning of that crisis. And this administration has borrowed for almost all of its major legislation. The Trump administration, before the COVID crisis, was also borrowing for everything. We don't have a lot of fiscal leadership here. But I do think when there is divided government, there's a much greater chance of seeing progress. And one of the stories that people have been talking about is the debt ceiling, the need to increase the debt ceiling. The narrative in the media, I think, has been pretty slanted, as though this is going to be the gutting of Social Security and Medicare if you attach changes to the debt ceiling increase. I don't think that's right. The debt ceiling has to be increased because this is borrowing from the past. What we need to do is first and foremost decide no new borrowing. No more for the rest of this year, no more for next year. I think divided government makes that more likely. We then have to agree to lift the debt ceiling. Yeah, I mean, it's only a month and a half, 2 months for the rest of the year. They could agree not to borrow anything for 2022. That should be the bare minimum. But they then do have to increase the debt ceiling, but it would make sense to include changes that will improve the debt at the same time that they increase that debt ceiling. Not talking about default. Please, we should not even have those words or hostage taken mentioned. But in the past, we used to include measures that improved the debt. I'd like to see that done responsibly.
So what about the deficit? The Congressional Budget Office reporting that the administration added $83 billion to the national debt in October alone. That's $2.7 billion in new debt a day. It puts the government on track for another $1 trillion deficit this year. Maya, what are the practical implications of that deficit?
Well, let me me be really clear. Deficit borrowing has a lot of negative factors regularly. But when you're in an era of high inflation, it is exactly the wrong thing to be doing. The way that the fiscal component of the government can help with inflation is to be spending less and or to be increasing revenues to decrease demand. The more borrowing we have, the more we're putting that into the economy. That is fueling inflation and making the problem worse. Yes, it's mainly monetary policy that's going to fix this, but every dollar of savings that we can have by reducing deficits from what they otherwise would be helps with inflation, and this continued borrowing is really jeopardizing American families.
So, Maya, you're calling on lawmakers to make a commitment to no more borrowing this year. Have you heard back? Do you think they're going to be able to do that next month without adding more to the national debt? You've got a couple of pieces of business here that they need to get to before year end. Can they do it without adding more to the national debt?
You know, it's interesting. We were talking to a lot of lawmakers before the midterms, and a number of people from both parties were interested in saying, I can agree that we shouldn't borrow anything for the rest of this year, and presumably that will continue in 2023 as year. But baby steps. All we can expect is baby steps right now. So we will see if there's a willingness to come together and say, we do have to fund the government. We're going to need a CR and omnibus, but have it not have any of that borrowing attached to it. Right now, people are all kind of thinking about what they can attach to the government funding bill that would include all their favorite priorities, and I can promise you, none of them are paid for. If we can get a small group that actually cares about this issue and promises no more borrowing in 2022, that would be a first step in the right direction, something we haven't seen in a long time.
Wow. Well, we'll see. Maya, it's great to catch up with you. Good to see you this morning. Thank you.